그래서 저게 내가 나버상 예비기 다 겹세들이야 건조숨 세케는 거래서 지난달 건조숨에 가려서는 사이에 건조 치워져 기능 건조숨에 예스케비우디 다들이야 안가 저게 겹유 숨디체 되는 아주 겸로세도 내가 nes라고 알았네 당한 저거 거의 동아 타달에 자고도 선배 삼로시다 다 거의 동아 될때 말하는 지금 민트 자고도 선배 삼로다 다 동아 될 교배 니버도 수로 열에서 파심주치도 다 겸내 건조숨들 열에 선배가 삼다 되네게 삼네 되네 야 겸내 건조숨나 아니 네 동아 타달에 교배 건조숨이 교불에 선배기 이체비게 삼로 이체비 삼로들 겸로라고 그래서 단 딩한도 아니 삼로디 기디나디네 삼다제 인도스네 야 공정오 공부대 다야게 삼로 직디레서 가지고 디는 쇼게 당아서 겸로 겸유당 는 겸로 세는디게 겹탕간 스겹고 어래서 온도스네 가지고 디슈가로.
Good afternoon. This morning we looked at refuge. And refuge is the training that Buddhists engage in that it's Buddhists and Buddhists alone who turn towards the three jewels, namely the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel for refuge. Refuge comes about then in dependence on the wish to bring an end to the sufferings of samsara. And the deeper one has reflected on suffering, the stronger one's refuge will be in that one will turn to the three jewels with an ever-growing confidence they have the ability to provide protection. And with this growing trust, we turn to them, knowing that through their guidance, we will cultivate the true protection within our own hearts, within our own mind. So here we need to repeat it, so that's going for refuge, and how to do so is to cultivate this confident trust in the three jewels by repeatedly engaging in this meditation. Moving immediately to the next verse, the 8th verse. Under the control of both karma and afflicted minds, wherever you will be reborn in this state of samsara, there is no chance of lasting happiness at all. Abandon karma and afflicted minds, Jambal Drak.
나가서 코와 봐서 내가서 코와 봐서 내나서 강아 유디겐 다디네기 라마메 바디네 유디겐도 코와 봐라 지선 당가서 코와디 깨와 가는스 링고레 라비도 가르레티네 링고레스르다 신규다 기 신실레 때네 긴고 깨와 링고르와 지선 코와 깨와르네 가르기 깨와 링고레스네 레다 뇨모니기 샤왕가세 지선 레다 뇨모왕기 깨와 링고레스 나도 코와 깨와서데 뇨모바지 깨 뇨모바 디기 레사 Digi Genjin also the Koala Kivalingores, Leda Nomo Niki said the Koala Kivalan body, you got related in the Lingores and Leda Nomo Ballet in the Kivalingore, said. Then was Koala Kivalim, Gudi Musum Gore, Gudi says.
Looking at the first line, under the control of both karma and afflicted minds. Maybe actually the first two together, wherever you'll be reborn in the state of samsara. So here, when we recognize that wherever we are born in samsara, whichever realm we are born in, we will suffer. One cannot take rebirth in samsara and not be bound by suffering. So why is it that we keep being born in these realms of suffering? Well, no one does so out of choice. This is not something that is under our own control, that we choose whether we're born in samsara or not, or where in samsara. It's not under our own control, but the control of contaminated karma and afflictions. And this is what we see in the first line, under the control of both karma and afflictions. It's through our afflictions that we then accumulate karma, and it's through the ripening of karma that we take rebirth in samsara. So therefore, the cause of our uncontrolled rebirth in samsara is contaminated karma and afflictions.
제상다 코와 기와 리면 규디 그래서 레다 녀모 바이들에 제상 규 녀모 바제 되네게 레사 되네 레기 왕게는 코와레 기와린 요레세트 규디지 다 샤왕기 세드 마자 샤왕기 라르코르위 기비 네 코르위 네갑기 가르기에 장시들다 제상다 게디 레다 규 녀모 바달레 게기 규 레다 녀모 바사 사바이나 델레기야라 하요 마레소레 베나 저기 디르와 지게 유튜브 채널 디부게를 하요 말 베나서 저 지역에 사원지민이 사원지마 답샤베네 델야 안지게 추단 규차상 소소베네 디가리아 신로마지 값샤베나 고라면 유고 파도 두신 코드 게임이나 저 고고진 게는 고 민이에 끼운 거라든 제상 유튜브 채널 하 지부 주에게 다 쳐버려서 제상 아주 유레다 녀모 봐서 코어게 유레다 녀모 봐데스 아주 코어게 유레다 녀모 봐서 사나 되네 아니 이게 라메바 코알 기용으로서 샤왕기 코르위 내가 게스 가르게야 코르위 내가 때 기그레스 제상 코르위 내가 가와게 바이나 가르게야서도 갑레 밀기그레 갑레 할기그레 갑레 둔돌 기그레 갑레 냐와지 가와 이다기스 가와게 바이나양 아니 지게 디니게 삼다면은 누하에 강아 신물마다 강아 매바지 가요 말해서 때 강아 연구해서 콜베 내가 가르게 양 강도 깨봐 있나야 아니 두어디 니가 님들 뒤나면 대요 고감해서 그디나 강아 직사회절에 지금 직사회절 지 연구해서 제사 강아디 좋아해 매바지 레디기를 해서 그래 고갑 매수디 띵기 대와 그디는 대와 녀야가 고갑들하게 말해서 요 말해서 그래 제 강아디 그디는 직 되었지 르르 되어요나 한치 남산 디젤에 강아 리용 그래서 그래
Looking at the first three lines, under the control of both calm and afflicted minds, this is the sequence that leads to what we see in the second line, wherever you'll be reborn in the state of samsara. Here, the key points that are being made are that when our rebirth is not something under our own control. We do not have freedom or free will over where we will be born, but it's under the power of our karma, which was accumulated under the influence or the power of our afflictions. So there is this sequence. Our afflictions lead to the production of karma, which ripens, and we take rebirth. That rebirth will be in one of the realms of samsara, but whichever of those realms it is, in the third line, there is no chance of lasting happiness at all. Wherever one is born in samsara, by the mere fact of being a samsaric being or being born within samsara, we will suffer. We will suffer. Whilst we may experience some happiness, this will quickly dissipate, and once again we'll encounter problems, sufferings, and difficulties. And this is something we have no choice over. We cannot wish it away. It happens not by our own choice or under our own power, but due to the power of our karma and afflictions.
ngāzu kōwa kēki gyūdi lēdā nyōmō pārē jēsā tā ngāzu kōwa lē kē nē kāngā dēne yungu yōpa nē tā kōwa lē kī gyō mārē kōwa kēwa dēlē tār kō kō rēs jēsā dēne kē tār kōwa yīnsā tā dī kē gyūdi mē bā sō kō rēs wē jēsā lēdā nyōmō pōngshē chāmbā chā sē dē jēsā kōwa kē gyū lēdā nyōmō pā dē pōngshē hō sē pōng kō rēs dē pāngshē bā yīnā nē kōwa lē kē yō mā rēs wē
Process of uncontrolled rebirth is really something we have no choice in as long as we remain under the power of our karma and afflictions. You can imagine if we plant a seed, it will sprout. If all the conditions are there, it will sprout. It doesn't do so by intention or our intention. We can't will it into being. The causes and conditions are accumulated, the result will follow. So understanding this then, Gendün Gyatso advises his heart students in the fourth line, abandon karma and afflicted minds. To express that differently, if you want to gain freedom from this continuous cycle of rebirth in the realms of suffering, you have to abandon the cause. And the cause is karma and afflictions.
Chama sidu mi shihen tumbo yobala jikpa tukshin jaja kangsun kuni tumbo meba soyaga samlo denishon dit chama dene jike juge kalhore decha kontro ngaja desu chaza de nyom ba se de nyom ba se de da jeng dum de ha ko de ha le la sho de nga zo kontro wa nga ge de che desu nyom ba de so nyom ba se.
What are illustrations then of afflicted minds or delusions? These would include anger, ignorance, attachment, pride, and jealousy. Amongst these, the one that is easiest to recognize is that of anger. These are all illustrations of afflictions.
다두스티나 dumdeshode 안저게 두그라죠 신가서 소재기 좋아 지도 아주 차된 나는 콩로한테 딩아 소재도 배선 콩로한테 직수에샤베나 진짜 나보 소재 딩아 줄이야 콩로시나서 녀모밖에 바래 데네기 콩로 디기 끼엔전에 맞도디 쇠샤 쇠고래 제가 쇠네 쇠여도 갑라 페니기 그 두자들이야 류소로 내바로 와다 내비기 데네기 내바 인자 나서로 마오바나 데네기 틱바 레세야데 데니기 가서 삼로 나리아 셈들이야 안지 데니기 마오바나 동아요야기 유지 데니기 삼로 나래 삼로들 리고 뉴바시 야고래 데니기 뉴바들 레세 거치자 레 니체산 데니기 레 뉴밤단 데니기 셈중 셈바세 중고래 데니기 더 쇠베 내가 콜야를 차와 제비기 내갑기 삼로지다 니 총딩의 셈중 셈바세 디로바 제가 레세 데니기 시치리 워들 레라 워들 제자다 뇽모바 당포 뇽모바게 디제라 뇽모디 겐전의 레사 디레지제 안나 모바나 가서 냐손을 게레 양 뇽모바 지고 뇽모바디 겐지 로바제 녜마 레사 유들이야 안지 로발마서 뇽모바 사바게 디 뇽모바디 안 겐제제 메니 안나 가서 게게 코발에 게게 게주야디 겐디 디제네 지고레 제자 레라 뇽모바 하세야디 어두스네 송거래.
An illustration of afflictions or afflicted minds include anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, ignorance, and many others. Of these, anger is the one that's easiest to spot. We have too much experience of this. For example, if we feel the bite of a mosquito on our arm, immediately anger will arise within us, and we may well respond habitually to that and swat the mosquito. So what's happened is, through being cognizant of the mosquito having bitten us, anger arises, and due to the power of anger, we have the intention to kill the mosquito, and then we quite possibly do so. First arises the affliction of anger, and from this comes then an intention to harm the mosquito. This intention is the created karma, which if we then act under its influence and we do kill the mosquito, the karma that is created is that much more powerful. And when that karma later ripens, because it's a non-virtuous karmic imprint, it will ripen in suffering. And if it's this or any imprint ripens at the time of death, the imprint that ripens at the time of death is propelled by an affliction, ripens due to an affliction, and propels rebirth. And because of the role of the affliction, one takes rebirth once again in samsara, and one continues to take rebirth in this process, life after life.
and di wangi le sabi ki le di geche just le dipa le gor dipa hasanga de dipa ponsho sa de dipa dir sure jesa khonra da desugi on nyomo ba desu le dipa re jesa di wanga so le shi ke le ngamba di ke dipa re jesa di pa pong ko re sa di dipa sa di ro le da nyomo ba sa di ke le da nyomo ba de da de desu le da nyomo ba sa dipa sa di so pong ko re sa di so ngor ba.
From afflictions such as attachment, anger, and pride, karma is accumulated. Karma that is accumulated by afflictions such as these is non-virtuous. And it's non-virtue that we saw in verse 6 that we need to abandon.
Dan sabun diga nyuge la dele roba sadan chudan jig lyro mangbu kien mangbu kugo wa jisan di kien mangbu mena sabun jig jos ga la sha sha nyuge gine ma ko nyuge nyubo yor de ne kien ma chang zang ho ji tuye gine me ba de jisan inji mi go jig pa lombo yo sa yo sa da din ji be ji de ma jig zero da de ne chulo ne de nyuge de kien chang yo de 내고 뉴기 용마도 사번디 연나양 긴 마차는 뉴기 메로 디나장 아주 냐와이다 만송기 얘기 디빌레가제 레디 사번나 레 여바네 긴 녀모디 마차바나 녀모메나 아니 예 gelegi tuya 말에 세상 긴 녀모 세상 당한 주기 개왕하만 방 만송기 디바바 시우시 사 여바네 레 망고 시우지 여바네 안주기라 Cedelia Anzugo, Com Yamnage, some Guat and Anzulia, to a child condro, Magese, Gima Jubaja, Gashabana, Dima Meva Sejabene, Giang Amigi Lady, Yobinea, and Digi Nansoniki to your mother. Says that it is a new more by the Paya, the Gachimburis, what I did.
Karma is when karma is created, it's often then referred to as a karmic seed. Because just like a seed in the garden, for it to ripen, the seed alone is insufficient for a sprout to arise. Ripening conditions need to be accumulated. If I were to take a seed and place it on the table here, it would just remain there. But if as soon as I put it in the appropriate, the right type of soil, with the right amount of moisture and warmth, it will ripen because it has the ripening conditions. Absent of the ripening conditions, a seed cannot ripen. And just like in the illustration of a regular seed, so too with a karmic seed. It requires the ripening conditions in order to ripen. When a karmic seed is placed on our continuum, amongst its ripening imprints, amongst the ripening conditions are the afflictions. If the ripening conditions are absent, the seed cannot ripen. So on our continuum, we have an immeasurable store of karmic imprints. Life after life after life, we've been creating these. So to cleanse our continuum of karmic imprints in its entirety is something that just cannot be done. But what we can do is eradicate the ripening condition of the afflictions. Because it's afflictions that are required for these non-virtuous imprints to ripen. So it's the afflictions that we have to abandon.
Le da nyomo china le se de le kiwi le da mi kiwi le ane jike kasore odine ge le na so yongor kiwi le se da mi kiwi le se da ane lungma de le se da dine yongor wa jesa da nga so yin ge ge gyudi ka de chi ho sne kiwi le mi kiwi le de chi gor wa da nga so ge dendro la da mi go ba ge le de ka de chi le de ka de sne dine ane kiwi le ge chi gor wa Givi le said the usual not to share the Kasana Shubanaji, Lunga Yusum Yogan, Shalia, Sawachi, me, some big some not Naji, the nigger, some not down, digging out the Trimche. Dene samdang de samlo digi nyamdo na ji semjo samba di kewele jisa dene samlo ba yebe wange shenlia cewa mi ba an chi jebe ne shenlia pembi ge jawa re je yodo ne kewele set kewele chago re je deso me de kewa le de la sabon de le de wa ro nyomo yongurwa dizadirwa da nganzu ge de jina de yonsir da di deshe jamo sinya gapta de lese de kewile se le kewile se da kan chungo sungure se ne de chilongo la gore se tambo di se
to people each time one takes rebirth in samsara, this comes about due to the force of a ripening karmic imprint. Karmic imprints are of three types: virtuous, non-virtuous, and neutral. Non-virtuous karmic imprints, when they ripen, they lead to rebirth in the lower realms. When virtuous karmic imprints ripen, they lead to rebirth in the higher realms, such as rebirth as a human or God. The illustration of a virtuous karmic imprint would be that of ethical restraint. We looked at that in a little detail yesterday. The mind that is determined not to harm others. I will not harm others through my physical actions, my way of speaking, and even restrain my mind from being harmful towards others. In fact, and moreover, so that is ethics, and this was often joined by of other virtuous minds, such as the wish to benefit others. When an imprint such as this ripens at the time of death, it propels rebirth in the higher realms.
ane dime bige da nga zu mili ne su mi kewa le de delia tunje ya wo ya ki ngyu le ane anji nga zu gi mili kewa de jige do da denba ane mi jika so wang bo chang wa an cha sang gi jige yi dong wa ye gi ane jige le anji le da mara yung go re jisa dine za ka sang zu shu ba na shin chujum sung wi ge sung de ane mi kewa lada mi go wang ge ge le de ju de sa go re je jinbi nyamlen je ju de ani di ke we ten ma ba na nga su ya tun ge yo ya ge le de sa go re le de tu go re je ta ding an zo go go ro wa mi ke we na ga wa yu tun ge go go ro de ne an ji ge sui bi nyamlen je du ane nga zu ma ba na de le ya nga zu ge ji ko so wang bo chang wa na an ji ge lu an do da dian ba yo de le de sa go ju cha go re se sa go re je 지난다 준주기 냠len 그서 준주 냠len 제도 마오바나 안 땡텔이야 최 냠len 지해게 삼로 계획이 되바 계획이 아니 냠len 지 고브라게 레사고래지 지자다 대송 안줄이야 밀계외나 디 고고로 와다 되네자 안주 규디게 사고래서디 다 가상 안주 주에디 김자로 디레다
Just like farmers just like farmers grow a wide variety of crops, they will know that each crop has its own specific cause. So too with rebirth. So to be born as a human being requires a specific cause, namely ethical restraint. And for this human rebirth to have an abundance of favorable circumstances requires its own specific cause, that of generosity. And for the human being, hopefully with now these favorable circumstances, to also have a personality that is inclined to being harmonious with others and to have complete sense faculties, that also requires a cause, namely patience. And to have a personality that is inclined to virtue and as someone who's will seek out the Dharma, wanting to engage in spiritual development, that too requires its own specific cause, namely joyous perseverance. Hence, yesterday we looked at these causes which are indispensable for one to attain a precious human rebirth.
지사당 안솔야 가른 오제 지구도 전에 안솔 디기연 동화연기 삼류톤에 디 연구래에서 삼로 가는 되셔 공정 아제기나 이제솔을 때는 가지고 강아 최고의 디연규리 디메바서 오래서 좀 오르지 지사당 안솔게 개와 디 가산의 주반에지 개위 자와 진보 수준서 전주 삼대 대선 냠는 제반에 아니 디기도 보어 대선도 냠는 제고래서 다디 오르 제바로 하다 지산 디기연당 강아연하기 유디 삼로 데니스 땅에나 디 연구래에서 된 가지고 오르 제바로 와 다 가르쳐 주고서는 다나도 되샤당 공동아 예디 대소연의 규단 긴질에 되는 연구를 다 디주가 가할 때는 연구를 해서도 다 델레 띵삽제 다 마서 짐발 마선 토하로 기시오래 띵사바로 제바제 삼다다데 제바제 띵사바로 진짜 다 되샤 안도 코와기야 다 되게 동안야데 규디레다 녀모벌기네 다 레다 녀모서 되샤 공동아 예디 녀모버시도 안 디수 가르쳐 가할 때는 기고래 시도 다 디수 데네실 기고래 세당한데 지가 오마된 마슈야래
Our suffering comes from an afflicted way of thinking. In other words, we suffer when anger arises, pride arises, jealousy and so forth arises. We suffer in this way and we create the causes for further suffering. So therefore, understanding this, we come to recognize that when our mind is afflicted, we will suffer and create the causes for further suffering. Accompanying this understanding is that when our mind is not afflicted, but rather virtuous, our mind is at peace and happy, and is creating the causes for happiness. For example, when our mind is ethical. In this way, we come to understand that it's through transforming our mind that we abandon the causes that will lead to suffering, and we cultivate the causes of happiness. Then the afflictions such as anger, attachment, pride, jealousy, and so forth, these also come from their own causes, and this we will be looking at in more detail. To look at it in more detail, we come to the 9th verse. This chronic disease of grasping at oneself as dear has caused each and every suffering experience in samsara. Forthwith, by means of the wisdom realizing selflessness, abandon grasping at oneself as dear, Jampaldrak.
Rang Jebel Zimbi doesn't Mariba says, Rang Daddy Rang Chizin said it doesn't Mariba who Rang Jebel Zimbi doesn't Mariba deletini Gigor Ejelda, Jisadan, Duecha Kondrong idea Mariba, that Chazan Yonsegi, Zawa, Shizel Mason, Tartu you, Tartu body, that the Garden Leoson, Rang Chizin it in doesn't Mariba deletini Gigor, Rang Jebel Zimbi, Johnny D. Deletini Gigor Ejel. That it doesn't Mariba.
All our afflicted minds, our delusions, anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, they all come from the root cause identified in the first line, this chronic disease of grasping at oneself as dear. This term I've translated as grasping at oneself as dear, you'll know more commonly as the self-cherishing mind. But the meaning of the self-cherishing mind or grasping at oneself as dear here, the meaning of it in this context is the ignorance of self-grasping. So ignorance of self-grasping is to be understood as the root cause from which all our afflictions arise, the root cause of all our suffering.
On that day, Sungor was the Rangchi doesn't Marik Patele, Rangche Basimba, doesn't Marik Patele Kigore, that is Denigi, that Chige on Dushin Sungor. Dana, Ranche Basimba, doesn't Marik Based, can say that you was Ligro, that can say, can chile Lagore, said Ligroda.
Well, if it's been said that the root cause of all our afflictions and our suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping, I imagine the question has arisen, what is this ignorance of self-grasping?
아두스데 당아도 차상라 나세베 덴진 다신 마릭 받리고래 제자도 시삼다데 아주 기디나 나서 삼로딩 아주 길 여러와다 나세베 당아도 가르치나 당보 가르쳐래 지게 기워지스나 나 칼라사고도 나 참참 주의 나 젤라고도 나 둘로 디공기 나 링가 당아 주의 사지 지 야로 있습니다. 나 최제가 두고 있어. 최냐 나 로전시가 두고 있어. 지난 당보다 가서 나 하세베 삼는 콜 디젤이야 나 두기. 되네. 나 하세베 삼는 콜나 디지기. 제디 지 지난 당보 삼는 콜나 하세베 삼랭우도. 디나신 나 세 당보 삼는 콜나 하세 삼는 콜네 나 코응알 누구도 코응알 나라 누구도 세. 나라 코 누구도 세다. 나라 거의 견주시기도 사 나라 거의 야부 지금도 사 지사 내내 지나간 중이야 나라 거의 누구도 와 지사데 독자에서 파코라야 안지 나라 거기디 닝주 난구도 선데네 곧 잡았지야 지사 나서 나라 디고도 나라 디고민도 세데 마고에 디들 가서 제때네 지사 나보 나서 략하라체나 나 세베 삼로지 리후도 와데 지사 리도 와 딩아서 냠뇨로 차기도 와데 나지지 제오다 나 조고다 나 지사 제오로 와데네
The ignorance of self-grasping is something that we all have. So we have this thought of I. When you watch your mind and you see where your thoughts are going, you recognize this thought of I as being at the very heart, at the very center of our motivation. So I'll make some statements where this is clear, but you need to look for this within yourself. I want to eat something. I want to go out with friends. I want some new clothes. So what you see in these three illustrations is from this thought of I follows I want. So there we have attachment, desire. Another set of three examples. I am being harmed. I am being belittled. I am being taken advantage of. Here, from this thought of I follows I do not want. This pushing away. And this then is what leads to the arisal of minds such as anger, perhaps jealousy.
언데서 친구도 하시다. 아주 아주 자산 냠녀에 와서 아주 자산 세부를 하고 뒤에 자기도 와대. 나도 지나 하고 된치도 땅 안에서 삼로디 앉아 식당 왔는다. 나 세딩 두 제대 소수게 로로야. 로를 봐지 소수를 나 세도 로를 직 철거로 와다 두 삼다데. 나도 쳐두가 로로야 간에서 철거도 세비게 다또 심주제나. 나 세 소소한 삼당 나 세 삼다데. 나 세도 로를 봐 간에서 철거도 세비 삼당에도 먼저 가려 하고 그래라나. 나 세디 지금 아주 풍부하다 샘다 델레파 로스 예티엔지 델레야 저메다 그런 로스 예티겐 디 지기 베셔다한 근데 모델 마서 모델 당한 제원 아신지 즉 간술이야 즉 나세디 아주 풍부하다 샘 델레 뭐 타데베 델레 로스 예티엔지 로르바 셔고레 디 셔고레 데네지 도스네 셔고레 디디 데네게 샤네 데네게 샤와 나신지 데네시 nga sepe denegi nga dele denegi shawa na shi nga dele mine zimpi lo dela dazen marik parang ne dazen marik pa se dilla gorda.
The illustrations I just gave, these are easy to understand because we have so much experience of this. But you need to recognize the validity of this for yourself. So that is the role that the I plays in leading to the arisal of the various afflictions, of the various delusions or disturbing emotions. But to look a little bit deeper then at at how the role the I plays in our suffering, we need to, and this is more difficult, come to gain an understanding of how the I appears to us. This I or sense of I, how it appears to us. When we look, we'll come to recognize that our I or a sense of I appears to be something different, independent of our body and mind. Or to use an illustration, like the driver of a car. So the driver we would recognize as being independent of the car, not being one with the car. So likewise, the sense of I appears to be different, independent of the body and the mind, or the body and mind we can express as the aggregates. So this is how the I appears to us. This needs to be seen, recognized ourselves. It appears in this way, and then a consciousness grasps at the I as existing in the way that it appears. This is self-grasping. This is self-grasping.
Dinigi nga saidi nga zuki pungpo dan number sheba gang la yang zhewa me de ho lo su yu be nga chi nang de zimbi lo di da zin marik ba sen de zinje dinigi yu mixe yu di yo re besen yo mar da ding ha de dinigi yo mar wa ji da me ba jigli ya ko ron nang je zin du yo re ji dan zin je ne an de le ya dinigi ko ron na de zin de nga de le mi zin je ne de le ya ne ji di ji je ne da ji ge ne an zu ge ji ge chapa kia dan, duasha kia dan, kongzhu kia dan, dine si yung go re se chi, da zin zin pa chi. Bena nga zu peru shawe na, nga zu ki meni ki chi ki bin chu zangbo shuwe na, zangbo zangya baya kam dangbo shu shuwe na, sena go dakaru shar duwe na, nga zu meni dadi dawa di jime chishin lo nango rwa, nango re. 나wan nango de ine dawa rebes na mare 지상 다와 지메 지진 로를 한 능고래 나와나 맨니 다와 두스메 진반데 진로디 노트 샤고와 제가 로로셰 니 나신 가르주야 지 다와 원에 나신지 능고래 나와 나신 다와 등원에 레베스는 데 레요 말에 니 나신 가르주를 나서 삼로들야 두스네 삼로 나나들 가네스 능고도 시병아도 심주지에도 나세디 랑게 풍보당 넘버 쉐바당 강라야 맞주바 되네 저메데 그런 딜레 로수 여버스 능고래 니 낭다딜레 다도 주바 나와시고래 니 진비기 진바들 다세 마리바시고래 제 마리바라도 그 유디 뭐네 또야요 말이야 그 마싱바 몽되딜레 마리바래 제가 딩아 좀 계획이 규조 디디레 될라는 리고래 니네 수딩 아저기 신고 말다 디 신고 거래 디 디레세 녀모바 자와 계획이 규디 디레세 디 숨을 제자든 다 nga said lola ganes nangudu labna phungbo da cheshe ga bo semda de nege ma tyo ba tele loso dele jame koron ngone yeba de nangore she beni chuna dawa nawa na de nangore 제자 di ngone ra yore dina re sembeda zimba dela da se mari pasi gore je da ding nga sula mocho go eli kechin bore 그 제자 디니게 다진 짐바 나신 데니게 나세도 여러 배스는 요 말에 세대 쉬는 게 다완 나신 다원원에 많이 받아 지발에 해제
In this sequence, the afflictions arise from grasping at ourself as existing in the way that it appears. And the way that the self or the I appears is as if it is independent of the body and mind. So there's an appearance of the self as if it is independent of the body and mind. That's an appearance to consciousness. Then there is a consciousness that apprehends or grasps at this appearance as being in accordance with reality, as being valid, as being true, as being real. This consciousness grasps at the I as existing in the way that it appears. So this is the process. We need to recognize first how the I appears. The statement is the I appears, the I or the self appears as being independent, unconnected to, or independent of the body and mind. So that's the statement. This needs to be recognized for oneself. Then to the extent one recognizes that, one can recognize then that this is how we believe the self to exist. So this is the grasping. Then we need to check, is this in accordance with reality or not? Because what we have heard is from this cause of the ignorance of self-grasping follows all our afflictions, whether it's of the I want, the attachment, or the I do not want, the anger class. An illustration that is often given here is if on a clear night, a clear still night where there's no breeze, one walks past a clear pond of pure water, or a clear pond, and one sees the reflection of the moon. If we were to take the reflection of the moon as being the moon, that would be a wrong consciousness. In the same way, when we investigate to see whether the I exists in the way that it appears or not, we'll recognize that this consciousness that grasps at the I as existing independently of the body and mind, this grasping consciousness is an ignorance. And it's an ignorance because the I does not exist in this way. So therefore, the grasping, which is the verb, the consciousness is one of ignorance because it believes something to exist in the way that it doesn't. Just like when one sees the reflection of the moon and believes one is seeing the moon. Here, we need to recognize how the I appears. Then we can see this process that we believe that it exists in the way that it appears. Thereafter, we investigate to see whether it does exist in the way that it appears or not. And when we recognize it does not, we'll know that that is an ignorance. Just like if we believe we've seen the moon and we investigate whether that is the moon or not, and we realize, no, it's just a reflection. And we'll know that that prior thought that believed that was the moon, that was an ignorance, because it's only a reflection of the moon, not the moon itself. So this realization of that the self-grasping is an ignorance, this is important.
Denigi dasin marikpa asen. Jezan denigi dasin marikpa se de ranche ba se me chone se didi dasin marikpa. Jezan digi ngar khobe dunga kunla char se di se. Ngar khorwe le khorwe dunga kunla char. Jezan digi denigi dasin marikpa de la tene ane desha khondro nyomo ba je. Nyomo wange le sa je deni khowal ma ki gores. Khowale keje ngazo chasan dunga nyoa di yongore so khowe dunga kunla chara set disore.
In the first line, this chronic disease of grasping at oneself as dear, and here we can understand that grasping at oneself as dear, or the self-cherishing mind, means the ignorance of self-grasping. The ignorance of this chronic disease then of the ignorance of self-grasping has caused each and every suffering experience in samsara. The second line then points out that from grasping at the self or the I as existing in the way that it appears, when it does not, therefore it is an ignorance. And from this ignorance arises the attachment, anger, pride, all these afflictions. And they accumulate karma. And this ripening of these karmic imprints is what keeps us bound in samsara, taking uncontrolled rebirth in samsara, leads to, and moreover, leads to all our experiences of suffering within each rebirth.
Denigi and Dangazuki Bendigo Koa Lembe Dunga Nyonjo Chasan, Zawadi that doesn't dishe, doesn't marik badi. That he and a meva so gurwada. That he can so or as Dangan to do Sine Shimjuchi or as a dambo. That he Kueda me said the Ganes Chimchigris, Chizang the Deji that Dambo some Dantadi to Sine Lolipanga says some Chizanga said the Lolpa nangdu ka da kanis nangdu se be ke du se di nangda di dang ba ha ko re ji da du se ne du nangda kanis nangdu se be ke jimji du se je ba ji de ka bla jing ha se de su su yu pung bo da nang sam lo de le lo su mo ji de la je wa me ba ko ron ji yue de ba ru ji nang go ro wa di nangda de na de nang go re di nang na wa na ji yo re se jin ba na da se ma ri kwa 다 되네게 나와나지 지여나 간스 요래서 내 심주시오 나와나시지 난구도 왔을 때 나와나시데 땡땡 누구인지 솔라 롤파 나와나시 우인지 솔라 요래 요 말에서는 심주시오 고 당서 제고 고다
What these first two lines point out is that the root cause of each and every suffering of samsara is ignorance of self-grasping. So there are different layers in this process that leads to the arisal of experiences of suffering. All these experiences of suffering have at their very root, their very basis, the ignorance of self-grasping. Recognizing this, who would want to keep this root cause of suffering? We all would want to eliminate it. So how to eradicate then the root cause of all suffering? So we need to investigate to see whether self-grasping is in accordance with reality or not. We've heard it is an ignorance, but we need to come to recognize whether this is the case. But before one can investigate self-grasping to see whether it is an ignorance or not, one needs to first recognize how the I or the self appears to us. That's the first step. And this takes some time to get a feel for the sense of self, that whether it does, as is stated, appear to be something separate, independent from our body and mind, from our aggregates. That's the first step. Then, knowing that this is how the I or the self appears, and we grasp at it or believe it to exist in this way, we then go into the second step of investigation, of analysis. Does it exist in the way that it appears? Does the I exist in the way that it appears or not? And that's the second step, that of investigation.
아주기 셰바디라 저와 매백이 직 나와나 쉬어봐이나 근데 가와 요래스 다디 안주 풍부데 샤샤제 가디 안지 샹다지로 좋아 요르베스 줘서 두에 삼다베나 데니기 좋아 매르와 아 수부데 샤제 가 치료되어 열라요 말아가지데 강변날 수부디데 강변날로 샤제 왜 가와 요스 나 치료 열라요 말와 나로 열라기라 수부여서들 열라기라 수수부 가와에 just 예 like 마도 수보단 제와 자네 나세데 치료 줘서 그게 민도아 매반장 수부 뒤다 낭샘다 수보디 되다 파 치료를 파 아니 나디 라민도아 제네 민도아데 매로아 다 매반장 다는 다 연의 가와 요래스네 다 나디 나 저기 낭샘다 부모님도 요거로와 제 부모님도 연네 아니 다 풍보되네 가 말어 와다 먼저 나세 차교 말 나 풍보세 나 차교 말어 와 제사단 셈디야 나 차교 말어 와 그래서 풍보되네디 나주 기시데 결혼 락바데 결혼 디 락바데 결혼에 비해서 마딩이 락바데 마든가 말을 하기로 와 네 수부르 네 수부 네 락바 네 강바데 마다 나 라그미도 와데 제사 풍보되게 되세네 나 차교 말어 와나 차교 말 또 심주시도 갑라 되네 셈데레야 마주기도 생활해배 말해서 제바치도 갈라 대한 차고 말 나도 심주지도 강삼질이야 심주도 시대 나세야디 또 제여도 가서 로라 나와나 생각들이다 대시 로라 가르스 난구스네 마주 풍보다 셈나 저 메디게 직코롱 메뉴도 난거로 되네게 나와나 생각이 파 제베네 풍보다 셈레 로수 치료디와 샤야라고 말해 낭 셈나 풍보레데 디데네 샤야라고 말. 대치다 니거 말해.
process of investigation means to investigate whether the self exists in the way that it naturally, spontaneously appears to our mind or not. The first step is our I independent or separate from our body and mind, from our aggregates, as it appears to be? Well, if I were to go, say, to the car park, could I do that without my body and mind? Of course not. So my sense of self has to be connected to my body and mind, even though it appears as if it's something independent of the body and mind. My I cannot be out there in the bush. I'm connected to where my body and mind are here. So the first step is to recognize it's not disconnected from our body and mind, from our aggregates. So it must be connected. So then we look in the individual aggregates, in the body and in the mind. So if our I were our body, we look then within our body to see which part of our body is our I. We could divide our body up into mentally. We divide it up mentally. We put a hand there, we put an arm there, a foot there, maybe some organs there, maybe a puddle of fluids over there. And we'd say, so which of them would we identify with? That is me. None of them. Because that is my hand, but it's not me. That is my arm, but it's not me. That is just a puddle of fluids from my body, but it's not me. So the I cannot be found anywhere in the body. So what about the mind? And again, the process of investigation is similar. And we come then to the conclusion. The I cannot exist in the way that it appears, as something independent of the body and mind, because it is not independent, it's clearly connected. And moreover, it doesn't exist within the body or the mind. So therefore, it cannot exist in the way that it appears.
Du chine nga du chine simju che de kabla ane du chine samda simju samlo dadi simju che de samlo dane du cheba cherwa samlo du sinde samda che cheba cherwa chesa samlo dan du cheba chi de chela ne ganzam chela gar ha gu re sene chesa da ran da se nga se di se su lo la na wa na shin zao gi ne min du chesa da nga ju ge rang gi phung bo da sem de le dewa me ba de le duen shen pe gi ane ji 코롱원이 줍디 다세 자오 나세데 자오기네 민두 선배게 다 되니게 랑기 풍보다 셈당 풍보를 마되바 랑원이 줍바디게 똥바디 하고 거래 진짜 랑원이 줍베게 되니게 랑원이 마주바데 똥바들라 다음에 봐세 거래 풍보라 마되베게 셈당 풍보라 마되 풍보가 보강로들라 마되베게 코롱원이 줍디바 자오기네 매바들라 똥바디 매바래 무인이 소리디 매바 차고 디 매바 똥바세고 다음에 발라고래 내내기다 또 심주전에 삼문알이야도 심주제제 가슴질이야 어다 풍보다 낭 풍보라 마디비기 랑원의 주비기 나세 자오기니 민두아 선배 하고 간 lödela 다음에 봐도 로라고다 다디 로시고라 디 로디 당한주게 당보 하모건 제바제 깨주 되네 깨서질이야 디 야네야도 검진에 되네 뉴벌 마소나 디 뉴버 차당 보고 그래서 그러다
This process of investigation, of course, is something we just do mentally. When we go through this investigation, we come to the conclusion that having seen how the self appears to exist, it does not exist in this way at all. It is not independent of the body and mind. I cannot find the self. It does not exist in the way that it appears. It is empty of existing in the way that it appears. In reality, the self or the I does not exist in the way that it appears to consciousness. It is empty of existing in the way that it appears to consciousness. This now understanding that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, this is an understanding that is in accordance with reality. Therefore, it is a wisdom. The prior consciousness that grasp that the self as existing in the way that it appears is not in accordance with reality and is therefore an ignorance. Now when we realize the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, it is in accordance with reality and therefore a wisdom. And this is a wisdom realizing emptiness. Or to say that in an expanded way, a wisdom realizing that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And another synonym would be the wisdom realizing selflessness. Each time we come to recognize that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears, this strengthens our habituation to understanding of reality. And just like with every meditation we do, we need to strengthen our wholesome, our virtuous habituation. So therefore, this meditation too needs to be engaged in repeatedly over a sustained period, so as to strengthen our habituation with the understanding of how the self exists in reality.
Pumbol de Matubika, Rango, when you took the Zawaki, Mindu, Sambiki, did how going to do by the time about Topas. That did how going to any the Lamsa and the DJ Karahaku, Ma said, Zawaki, Meva Rebesan, Meva Mare Yores, and I say Yorwa, and Achitan and I said Yorwa. In a Lola Nawan as dishing on some Lona Lola Chawan and Shinchik, Nadi Mindus. Tanga the Candace Yores and Manzu Pumbol Pa. 电呢，碰破了对些，电把碰破了电把，得了怕略大把怎么明大，略怕大把怎么样的是大把怎么样的事情，还我都不理解的。
Meditation thus far comes to the conclusion that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. The self is empty of existing the way that it appears. And this is the wisdom realizing emptiness, or the wisdom realizing selflessness. The next step, the final step then in the meditation, answers the question, but does that mean the I, the self, does not exist? Me here doing this meditation, do I not exist at all? Am I non-existent? So the final step of the meditation is to recognize that whilst the I does not exist in the way that it appears, the I does exist. And how does it exist? As a dependent arising. It exists, or to express that maybe a little clearer, it exists in dependence on labeling by mind. Or instead of labeling, one can say in dependence on imputation by mind, or in dependence on designation by mind. So the self does not exist in the way that it appears. That self is non-existent. But the self of the I exists merely labeled by mind.
Chizan da meba tobe sherab sido deji tata nganzu lol ya nga sayate kanis nangidu se cheba chidu kabla kaala ima to rangwani druba achi korangwani drubdu bachi nangore. Dinna wana shinchi kanis du se cheba chidu pumbo dang kaa sing rangi semda pumbo la tyoba meba rangwani zoba rangwani drubduke nga di mindu sambe tobe lo de la da meba tobe sherab sigore. Di gombo yodu deji rang chizin dasin marik pa sayate Pungores, Chazan di compassion, Pungores. Pungores, Rang Jason said, Dasan Kishim, but Rang Jason said, Rang Datu Trubas in Battle Go Dasan, that they got Rang Jason Zimbabwe said, Dasan Marik by the Pong said.
The verse then concludes with, forthwith, by means of the wisdom realizing selflessness, abandon grasping at oneself as dear, Jampaldrak. Remembering then that grasping at oneself as dear, usually translated as the self-cherishing mind, here means the ignorance of self-grasping. Here, Gendün Gyatso is advising his heart students and thereby also advising all of us. We must immediately, forthwith, strive in cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness, realizing that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. We can understand the wisdom realizing selflessness and the wisdom realizing emptiness then as synonymous here. This wisdom that is in accordance with reality is what we need to cultivate, because it is the antidote to grasping at oneself as dear, or grasping the ignorance of self-grasping. This is what we need to cultivate.
Lord Pana do Pumbo da Rangi Semna Pumbo Kala Madu Rangun Juba Shina now on Ashi Yori Simba doesn't Ranchi doesn't Maripashawa. That Dame about to be Shiraladu, the Niki Tahati Na said Rangi Lola now on Ashi Pumbo da Chike Rangi Semna Pumpola Matuba, Dewa made the Rangun Juba the Mindus and Zingura. When you dojo chara, Zindaro, Masona, Chidi, Yore, somebody, Chidi, Mere, Yomara, Sambe, Zimbashagoro. She's not that in it, and Yoma Dami about Topi Ludish, Dame to be Shirati, the Niki Da, say, Na, say, Pumbota, Marangi, Pumbo, Lamatio, Kala, Matio, Bugge, Rangu, when you're talking in Mindua, Sambe Lodi, Nubacheria, chair, how going on do, and the Yore, Sambe, Zimba, Chiki, Komeva Chargora. Konin Mason Sarana, she's not the Niguloria, Nuba Church, Gomikaze, Cherona, the Yores and some nine, rushing to Bazimbe, Tado to Bazimbe, Yores and some of my Nuba Church, Ganzela Meva Charugor. The Nigi Meva Chavaina, Dasindi, ranching some of Meva Chavana, then Dusha Yama, Condra Yama, Yomo Yama, Lesor. Nikia Mena didn't also get less I Yomare. She's not dinner. Koala Bantugure, Koala Tartugure, Dingy Teva to 2 hours. She's not Dineza, Dame about to be share of Gombure. Said the Dangan Yomo Batsawa, Dunga Zawa, Gudi, Dasen Marik Pasede, Dipa Meva Seshabana, that's our Pansawanza, Guni Shin Zawa, Shinlama Zawa Pakoshan, Yaga Guni Yomaro, Mahobana, and Dunga. Yomo Bakuni Mary, Yomo Bakim, Mena, didn't detail Dunga Mary, Nasola Yomares, she's not dinner, that's our Nepaya de la Meva Sukin, Sumeva source, and Dame about to be shared up the combalet in the Meva Sugores, she's not Dame about to be shared up. Je Ponshi said, Ranchi Comje, Ranchizingi, and doesn't marry Pankore, said Tisungoro.
These two terms, the ignorance of self-grasping and the wisdom realizing selflessness. We can hear from the words that they are contradictory. Ignorance and wisdom are contradictory. This means then that if it's the ignorance of self-grasping that is the root cause of our remaining bound in the suffering realms of samsara, experiencing problems and suffering almost continuously, to the extent we can weaken this ignorance of self-grasping, we will suffer less. And when this ignorance of self-grasping is eradicated, we will never suffer again. This is why cultivating the contrary mind, the wisdom realizing selflessness, is essential. The ignorance of self-grasping is a mind that is not in accordance with reality. The wisdom realizing selflessness, or the wisdom realizing emptiness, is a contradictory mind that is in accordance with reality. So if you think of these two and their relationship, using those old-fashioned scales with weights, as one makes the side of wisdom stronger, the side of ignorance will weaken. As we develop our realization of the wisdom realizing selflessness and become ever more habituated to understanding how the self exists in reality, the contrary mind, the opposing mind, this ignorance of self-grasping, it will weaken. And to the extent that we strengthen our wisdom and we weaken our ignorance, the afflictions that result from the ignorance of self-grasping will be less frequent, less strong, and the duration will also be less. So in this way, we will suffer less. And when eventually our wisdom is so strong that the ignorance of self-grasping is completely eradicated, lacking the ignorance of self-grasping, no afflictions will follow. Therefore, the ripening conditions for karmic imprints will be lacking. No non-virtuous karma will be able to ripen. Therefore, we will gain freedom from being trapped in the confines of samsara. In this way, liberation is achieved. For this reason, then, the cultivation of the wisdom realizing selflessness is indispensable to bring an end to pain, an end to suffering.
And I said, Dondala, Mingbo, the Winnis, the Canisiors, and the Pumbola, the Rangi, Semda, Pumbola, Tene, Della Mochibo, Moyeme, Della Matim, Rosu Joma, Della Tene, Della Moyeme, Yoba, and Della Tapa Tapachi Yoba, the Tana Yobachi, yes, and the Winnis to Yoba. She's not a Winnis so long, I said, Pumbo Dang, Rangi, Sem Kala, Matuba, Colon, when you do what so in the Mebare, Winnis Tidio. Mebares, just I think the Mebare, in a Lola, now the Denis Yoba, Nanji, Zindu, or did Zimbe to Loshi, so that doesn't matter what I did, said that or duration I did what. Now, said Jorwa, now the Pumbo de Leongo, Rosu Yoma, the Pumbo Latine, Pumbo Longo, Yelme to native, Pumbo Semla, or Yemi to native, Jeza, Delapal. To
say then a little more about how the I or the self does exist in reality. What is the I then that is when we say I am going or I am eating? So how the I does not exist is independent of the body and mind, something unrelated, disconnected from the body and mind, despite appearing so. But rather, the I is merely imputed or labeled onto the body and or mind. The I is not something unrelated, independent of the body and mind, but is actually indivisible from the aggregates. The self is indivisible from the aggregates, but only insofar as being labeled onto the aggregates, onto the body and mind, does not exist from its own side or independently, doesn't exist by way of its own nature or essence. It is, though, indivisible from the body and mind in that it is labeled, merely labeled onto the body and mind.
Yuebe Kapla, nga de Yelagora, nga de Yelagora. Subu de Yalamba, nga Yalang de Yelagora. And then Company to combat Truguena, nga Trugu Yelagora. Tis Denis, then nga said, Dueda, and Yalang draw said, Chasan Pumbola Dine, Pumbola Dine, and Chiguedi Bache, and the Delpa and Pumbo Guyotanto, the Nato Guyas, Pumbola Dine, and the Jipa, Nato Guyas Pal, Tagorwa. Just a Pumbo does dirty, then he Pumbola dirty was not dirty years and a Pumbo del more Yermeche, Yermebas, Delia and a dirty years, Pumbo dirty was not dirty years and Lupa Tagoro. The Nigi. Just a Lupa Pumbola Dine, Tapa says he, and the Yevade, Pumbo the more Yermeto, Yermebache, Pumbola Dine. And if I live part done, not do the year, my yalan, not do said Lucian, and the Jiki Shigo.
It's been stated then that the way the I or self it can be said to exist is that it is merely labeled onto its independence on being merely labeled onto the body and or mind. So this has been stated, but how do we know? Well, right now I would say to you, I am sitting here. And why would you accept that? Because independence on my body's posture, you can see I'm sitting. And then if I were to get up, I would say, and now I'm standing up. And I could say this and it'd be correct because this is what my body is doing. And then I'd walk out and I'd say, I'm now leaving. And I'd be able to say that and it'd be correct and you'd all agree because independence on the movement of my body, we can say, I am sitting, standing, or walking. We're merely labeling, or merely or only or just labeling that, I onto the activity of the body, and thereby we can see that there is a relationship between the body and the I. They are not independent or separate, unconnected, but actually they are indivisible.
지난 네가 소강도 셈 되네게 셈 기우 될 봐, 초와 기우 될 봐, 안디 가세 열매지 될 봐, 뢰 봤다 거래. 지상 가세디 랑게 셈을 되네, 파뢰 다네 요레스. 랑게 풍보라 되네, 뢰 다네 요레스. 마도 풍보다 셈라 마되 봐, 뢰 파 마다 베게 가세도 요 말해서 그렇다 된다 니보디. 지금 오열매로 와대. 디초 지금 오열매란 디고라 오열매서 열매라고 뭐 집발에서 지가서 셈들이 디가서 마 대우도 라비도 초와 대와지 딜레 로소 나지 샤메로 와대. 지금 디 코로나 델파 뢰파 딩아데스 마디우 뢰파 따고 지금 디가서 마데다 근데 초와 대와니 보디 열매 개발 샤메도 그렇지. 난고 로라바 직 요르와 되네 여데 될바 마디우여 살다고 되네 심기우미데 나기우미도 살디다고.
Just before I translate what Gendün said, in the last few segments I've said that the body and mind are indivisible from the I, which is labeled onto them. So just I checked with Gendün, he said that's fine, but just completely what he says is not just indivisible, but indivisible in essence, or indivisible in entity. So, and I'll say that now in the new segment. So in the previous segment then, I mentioned how the sense of self, the I, is indivisible in essence from the body. And we label I into I am walking, I am standing, in dependence on the posture of the body or the movement of the body. So too with the mind. If you ask me, how are you? I would reply, I'm in a good mood. And what would the basis be for me saying that? I'm quite happy right now. My mind is relaxed. I'm in a good mood. So independence on my mind, I label I onto that. I am happy. My mind is one of happiness. I'm relaxed, I'm happy, and I label I onto this mind. Just like in the previous segments, with the posture of the body, one labels sitting, standing, walking. So too with the mind. I'm in a good mood. This is, the mind is in good mood, and I label my mind onto that. I am in a good mood. So therefore, we here also see that the I is indivisible in essence from the mind, just like before, where the I is indivisible in essence from the body.
Medi chabro chabdu ane chikoro subuti ki pa chik kangba lawa yu che chabdu kabla 내가서 미디기 타고 둘라고로와 미디데 그 수부디 안주가 통해야 수부 교단에 통고로와 그래서 수부 교단에 통하지는 수부디 교단에도 해라 아주 미디기 타고도 세대 디가서 그 수부 대다 미니디 개발체에 수부를 띄네 방아주기 미디센 바를 봤다고로와 아니 미디기 빠진 아주 통해야 돼 가서 미디기 개마셔 좀다 돼 미디기 개마셔도 라고로와다 제가 아주 통해야 돼 거의 그 수부기 넘기를 통과하래 제가 내내게 수부 넘기 때라 때는 미디 개마쇼도 세팅 아주기 내내게 수부 넘기 때라 파 따지는 미디 대다 개마쇼게 미디 아니 코로나 나가 개마쇼 라그로와 제가디 개마쇼 미디다 개마쇼게 루이니디 예르메스 뭐 때라 때네 안 바기마쇼스 뢰파 따고 그러지 제가 나세야디 아주 무인니술라 풍보다 낭 수기 풍보다 낭 셈라 되네 다 텔라 되네 안르 다바지 요래 되는 요래 마도 다 셈다 풍보라 뭐 제메 주님 되바 메바 뭐 제메 코롱원에 로서 주디게 가지 요 말레스 디 메바 또 별로더라 다 메바 또 별로레스 디 메바 또 별로도 고미도 장은 치신 다세 마릭 바디 바 메바스 투고레스 디 메바스 되는 녀모바 차상기야 요 말레스 디네 띵이 코반 동화 자원이 메바스 투고레스 너도 나 인보디 마디 슈고르 당도
In the meditation, we recognize through this process that this is the case with myself, and if it's the case with myself, so too must be the case with others. So we can call to mind if we were to watch a performance where people perhaps are dancing. So if we see a person doing a solo dance, we would say, he is dancing. We don't there differentiate between the movement of a body and that person. We may know their name or we may just know them as a dancer, but we'd say the dancer is dancing. We do not differentiate them from their body, but we label that the person, the self, onto their body, and what independence on what their body is doing, we say the person is dancing. Likewise, if perhaps at the end of the performance, when they're receiving applause, they're smiling broadly, we'd say, they are very happy right now. They're happy with the performance and their recognition from the audience. They're in a good mood. How do we know that? We have no idea what's going on in the mind, but we can see their facial expression. So independent on their body, we label that person as now being in a good mood. So we see here too, with ourselves and with others, that the body and mind is not the self is not independent from the body and mind, but rather are indivisible in essence. And the way the self does not exist is as being independent. The way it exists is dependent, in particular dependent on labeling by mind. So therefore the self is empty of existing independently, but exists merely labeled by mind. This recognition that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears is in accordance with the reality. So the realizing consciousness is a wisdom. The wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom that realizes that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And it is the contrary, the directly contrary mind to the ignorance of self-grasping, the ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears. And this wisdom is the direct antidote to the ignorance of self-grasping, and that ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause of all the sufferings in samsara. And to the extent we cultivate the wisdom that is in accordance with reality, we will suffer less, and eventually we will be able to eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping in its entirety and gain liberation.
Dine enzadan anzo tawa tame ba topi de toya de chikale khashore chagore chezadi chige ko yane yangdo samdang jeba cheche to hoya ki gyumche mangbo samdang jine ne hago tu ma de shen jingan de lamsa de hago ya de tame ba se hago ya de le la wo she yu chago ma de.
this topic of the wisdom realizing emptiness is the most difficult to cultivate, the most difficult to realize, and needs extensive study in order to have sufficient knowledge to be able to meditate with powerful enough reasons to eradicate this ignorance of self-grasping that we are so habituated to. So this is difficult to understand, and in particular, it's difficult to gain realization in a way that is beyond a mere intellectual understanding.
지난달에 가보래 양아치 소수기 준비잖아요. 즉 준비잖아. 안에 제 갈래 하고 간에네 마신야 지요 말해서 받아 지상아 주 소수기다 직접하지 장바나 곧 도와줘야 돼. 신야여야 돼. 지상 겁나 라워 미교로스. 곰바이나 리카스가 갈래 하고 차고 말이래라고지 하고도 그래서
And whilst this is something that's difficult, because we've achieved this remarkable precious human rebirth, if we utilize joyous perseverance, what is difficult can be overcome. And this is achieved in many quarters of life, that through perseverance, one can achieve something quite remarkable. So too here.
나는 나중에 롭산디게 가르레스나 당하주 코와 개발해야지 레다 녀모바세 디 코발게를 규디 지차고레스 녀모바세데 되자 공정하게 안지게 되술라 녀모바세 제수기 지기는 량안바사 제수 코와 개동아 규레스 제수 매바스요 그래제 제수 매바스요 원은 제수기에 규디 가르레드니 기워스는 다세 마레바랑 제바심베 다도 다세 마리바 델레드니 기워레스 지산디 다세 말해봐도 매봐서 그래서 디 매봐서에게 삼로 가는 땅고래라도 지산 다음에 봐도 배셔럽세야지 아주 곰째바째 다음에 봐서 또 하고 다음에 봐서 하고 같이 되나 하고 그게 셔럽들라 다음에 봐도 배셔라고 디바 곰제는 디 양아도 고해디래 디 곰제 뭐 곰에 땅고래 디 곰에 따발을 때네 아니 다세 말해봐도 매봐서도 그래 다시 말이바 매바스나 아니 녀모발라 되샤 컨트롤라서 기야요 말에 디메케베나 코발라 기야요 말에 에서지 다 디링나 저기 녀모 잡로게 롭센디기 나디 망아저 삼나 따야디 가르에서나 다가지 다 매바 또 베셔럽디 가즈레 마기 기에게 된다라 디 삼당고레 디 다매바 또 베셔럽 기에주 디 개발했는데 디 뭐고마도 공고고레 에서지 당아저 두시네 코와기에게 규디는 시에서 뭐였어 게 규디게 간에 용어서네 디규데스 데제 마릭바테나 용고레세 디고요소 디 매바서야 간에 용어서네 다매바도 베시라티 공고레 디곰바데 매바서 고레세 등아주게 냠술래하게 로디다 다매바도 로세야디 냠는 체고레스 매바서야디 되자 콘정하게 디규 다세 마릭바데 매바서 고레스 제상한서 삼론나라 디여바데 삼론 매바서가 디리디레 냠술래하게 삼로디 디레 세디가서 두시기 다 여와체 두스 What
we've looked at today, or had an introduction to today, is these samsaric rebirths and all the sufferings that we experience are due to the ripening of contaminated karma that we have accumulated, and it is ripened through the power of our afflictions. And this is this process that keeps us bound in these suffering realms of samsara, where we found ourselves since beginning this time. We've looked quite a bit deeper at the very foundation of this process of suffering and identified that it's the ignorance of self-grasping. But this situation isn't one that is hopeless, because there is a direct antidote to this ignorance of self-grasping, and that is the wisdom realizing selflessness, or the wisdom realizing emptiness. When we come to realize emptiness, the ignorance will first weaken and eventually be eradicated. When it is eradicated, because the root cause is gone, no afflictions will ripen. Therefore, there aren't any ripening conditions for our contaminated karma to ripen, which means we cannot again take rebirth in samsara. Not only that, we cannot again experience a moment of suffering. We will have attained liberation or freedom, liberation from samsara, freedom from samsara. So therefore, this wisdom that is contradictory to the ignorance is what we need to cultivate. Because this is the path to freedom, freedom from suffering. And it's something that is difficult, but is not beyond us. All of us can do it. Through gathering knowledge and integrating it repeatedly over a sustained period, we too can attain freedom from suffering.
Ganesh do pumbo da de some down, mas pumbo da some now, same now do me do chilo do me do shin, and some do sit low ngadi chada de some daji do shin, sheber che some tavena, jike jigene, and you get what chances to us and begin the low chag in Yangayore. Chance over to us, Yam temporary to us. I said to some that the cans I am temporary to us as a
So we'll conclude here then for today, but I encourage you to not take any of these classes, but certainly not this one, as a mere gathering of knowledge, but rather in your time together and alone, reflect at what's being presented here. In particular, the first step is really difficult. Try to come to see how the I, the sense of self, appears to you. The theory is that it appears as if it is independent or unconnected or separate from our body and mind. But this you need to see for yourself. Merely hearing this and then saying, oh, it doesn't exist in this way, will not lead to transformation. You need to recognize it for yourselves. So it may seem a little strange, especially if you're hearing this for the first time, but have a look. Try to see in reality, how do you, or not in reality rather, in actuality, how do you believe you exist? And this is something of remarkable importance to do. So thank you. We can conclude there for today, but if there's still questions, then feel free to ask. You have one? Sure.
I got thrown off by the essence part. Is it sort of saying that it's synonymous verbally with the body and mind? Is that what Geshe is saying? That the I is kind of, you can use it as a synonym for mind, like mind is happy. It's a verbal synonym, but not in reality.
So Gela was saying that the sense of self and the body and mind are indivisible in essence. Then what does it mean to be indivisible in essence?
So which bit is he saying is indivisible in essence? Is he saying that the self or the label of self?
Okay, it's the self or the label of self, indivisible in essence from the body and mind.
Isn't that the way you should Tumbajo? Then as the way you should learn the message Yoruba, then as a message Yoruba, the Ian to your body, the Yoruba, and Chazang Nasa Yoruba. Isn't the name Nasa, we need to learn how they can show us there, as Pumbo de la Dune, and Chipumbo de Long, Lumo, Loss Media, Pumbo la Dune, and the Pablo Tabas of your essay.
The self that exists in reality, the mere labeling of self onto the aggregates, that is indivisible in nature from the body and mind. So the merely labeled self.
That the to Jawajia, Yamajia, Chicha, Pumbola dinner type of Nasia Chigores. That Pumbola mother Rangwini Ranchicasa, Ranya to be Sisu to be Na, rang ngone to be nga said yomares. Jisan di yomares. Jisan di yoresembe lodi no to yoresembe zimbadi marikpa doesn't marikpa sigora shisa nga de ya tsipejida terang pumbola dine tape nga said na pumbola madio ba rang ngone to be nga said ni chene da yoba de kagres pumbola dine tape nga de yore pumbola madio rang ngone to be nga de yoma nga said yomares dus chikore.
In this process, you'll come to see that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, but that doesn't mean that one does not exist. Rather, the self exists merely labeled by mind onto the aggregates of the aggregates. So the way the self appears, and here we can use many synonyms, is it appears to exist by way of its own essence, its own nature, its own characteristics, from its own side, or independent. It's all saying the same thing. But when we investigate, we cannot find a self that exists by way of its own essence. But we do find a self that is, but the self does exist, but merely independence on merely being labeled by mind onto the aggregates. So where the self is labeled by mind onto the aggregates, they are indivisible in essence, but the self does not exist by way of its own essence, independently. Okay. And thank you very much.